Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights and pulling back the heavy, velvet curtains on an era often romanticized in sepia-toned photographs, the Victorian age. We're going to peek behind the lace and the top hats to discover some truly unsettling truths. You might imagine a time of elegant manners, grand inventions, and genteel society, like something out of a classic American novel set in old New England or a charming Christmas movie. But tonight, we're diving into the disturbing facts about everyday life in the Victorian era and more. Forget your worries about bad Wi-Fi or a long commute. You'd probably need a strong constitution and a whole lot of luck to survive a typical Tuesday back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it for you? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the disturbing realities of Victorian life. Our first chilling stop on this journey takes us straight into the heart of a Victorian home, or perhaps a grim hospital ward, to confront medicine's horrors and quackery. Forget your modern emergency rooms, sterile operating theaters, and evidence-based pharmaceutical drugs. In the Victorian era, medical science was a terrifying mix of nascent discovery, barbaric practices, and outright fraudulent claims. Imagine yourself in a bustling American city, perhaps Boston or New York, in the mid-19th century. You're suffering from a persistent cough, or maybe a mysterious fever. Where do you turn, and what horrors might await you? The understanding of the human body and disease was, by our standards, incredibly primitive. While some groundbreaking discoveries were on the horizon, like germ theory, slowly gaining traction towards the end of the era, most doctors still relied on ancient theories. Like the imbalance of humors in the body, this meant treatments were often based on guesswork, superstition, or tradition, rather than actual scientific understanding. You might Google your symptoms today, but back then, you'd be guessing from a very limited and often dangerous menu of options. One of the most terrifying aspects was the state of surgery. Imagine you've broken a bone, or developed a nasty infection that requires amputation. Anesthesia, while slowly becoming available, ether and chloroform were introduced in the mid-1840s, was still far from universal or perfectly understood. Even when used, patients often suffered greatly, and the operating theater itself. It was anything but sterile. Surgeons, often wearing their street clothes, would operate with unwashed hands and instruments, moving from one patient to the next, carrying infection with them. The concept of bacteria was largely unknown or dismissed. You might worry about a hospital superbug, but at least your surgeon isn't wearing a tweed jacket that's been in a dozen other surgeries. The pain? Oh, the pain. Even with early anesthetics, surgery was an agonizing ordeal, without antibiotics. Post-operative infection, or sepsis, was rampant and often fatal. A successful surgery might just mean you survived the knife, only to succumb days later to a raging fever as your wound festered. Imagine undergoing a limb amputation, feeling every cut, then slowly dying days later from the invisible enemy thriving in your open wound. It makes you realize how much we take for granted the miracle of modern pain relief and infection control. Beyond surgery, the general treatments were equally disturbing. Bloodletting, a practice dating back to antiquity, was still common, believed to rid the body of bad blood. Leeches were a popular tool for this. Imagine feeling weak and ill, only to have a doctor drain more of your already precious blood, making you even weaker. Purging through powerful emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to induce severe diarrhea was also frequent, aimed at clearing the body of toxins. These aggressive treatments often left patients more debilitated than the illness itself. It was less about healing and more about hoping your body could survive the cure. Then there was the rampant world of quackery and patent medicines. Without strict regulations, anyone could claim to be a doctor or sell any concoction they pleased. These medicines were often mixtures of alcohol, opium, cocaine, or other dangerous substances, marketed as cure-alls for everything from toothache to consumption. Imagine a traveling salesman promising a miraculous elixir for your chronic pain. A bottle filled with what is essentially highly addictive narcotics, leaving you feeling better in the short term, but addicted and ultimately sicker. The misery was not just in the illness, but in the deception, the false hope, and the dangerous side effects of these unregulated remedies. You might see a sketchy ad online, but back then, that ad could literally kill you. A common historical fact. Laudanum, a highly addictive tincture of opium, was widely available and prescribed for a vast array of ailments in the Victorian era. From headaches to coughs to female troubles, it was even given to infants to soothe them, leading to widespread addiction and accidental overdoses. Its easy availability highlights the era's poor understanding of drug addiction and its reliance on powerful, symptom-masking substances as cures. Imagine your grandmother giving you a spoonful of what's essentially heroin to help you sleep. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about Victorian medicine involves the use of arsenic in cosmetics and tonics. While we associate arsenic with poison in diluted forms, it was sometimes marketed as a complexion enhancer, believed to make the skin look whiter and clearer, or as a tonic for various ailments. Imagine a woman seeking to achieve the fashionable pale complexion, unknowingly poisoning herself slowly with arsenic-laced face cream, suffering from nausea, hair loss, and eventual organ damage. This disturbing practice showcases the era's desperate desire for beauty and health, combined with a profound ignorance of chemistry and toxicology, turning vanity into a slow, agonizing form of self-destruction. It's like your beauty secret literally being a dose of poison every day. The poor faced even greater medical horrors. Without the means to pay for doctors, they often resorted to even more dubious quackery, or simply suffered at home without any medical attention at all. Workhouse infirmaries were grim, overcrowded places where diseases spread rapidly and care was minimal. For the working classes, falling ill often meant financial ruin, further compounding their misery. The psychological impact of such horrifying medical realities was immense. It meant that illness, even a common cold, was fraught with extreme anxiety. Every symptom was a potential death sentence. Every visit to a doctor a gamble with your life and sanity. This fostered a profound sense of helplessness, a realization that your body was fragile and unpredictable, and that even those meant to heal you might instead cause greater harm. The misery wasn't just in the physical pain, but in the constant dread of falling ill and the lack of reliable hope for recovery. The academic debate concerning the true impact of Victorian medicine often grapples with the tension between individual patient outcomes and the gradual progress of scientific understanding. Some historians argue that while specific treatments were often brutal and ineffective, the Victorian era was also a period of immense scientific inquiry and foundational discoveries, like the work of Pasteur and Lister, suggesting that the seeds of modern medicine were being sown, and that for every horrifying story, there was also incremental progress that eventually led to better outcomes. They contend that the misery was a necessary part of the learning curve. The misery, in this view, was temporary and led to eventual triumph. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the vast gap between scientific theory and practical application for the majority of the population, arguing that for most Victorians, particularly the poor, medical care was largely ineffective, excruciating, or actively harmful, making their experience of illness truly horrifying and life-threatening on a routine basis. They suggest that modern medical comforts make it difficult for us to truly grasp the profound and widespread suffering. It's a debate that makes you ponder the terrifying reality of being truly at the mercy of your own biology in an age without comprehensive scientific understanding. As the chilling echoes of Victorian medicine and the unsettling specter of medical quackery from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday illness in the Victorian era was a truly horrifying experience. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental challenges that brought real misery, profound pain, and often an early death to millions. Their health, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of agonizing treatments and deadly infections. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, pervasive miracles of modern medicine, the sterile hospitals, the effective drugs, and the understanding of disease, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the chilling echoes of Victorian medicine and the unsettling specter of medical quackery from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calm, we now turn our attention to an insidious and often beautiful source of misery in Victorian life, fashion's deadly embrace. Forget your comfortable, breathable fabrics and safety standards. In the Victorian era, the pursuit of beauty and social status through clothing often meant wearing literal poisons, enduring excruciating discomfort, and even risking your life for the sake of style. Imagine yourself as a fashionable lady in a grand parlor in, say, San Francisco or New Orleans, circa 1870. You're admiring your new gown, perhaps a vibrant green silk, or a delicate white creation. It looks stunning, but you're unaware that its very beauty could be slowly killing you. Or perhaps you're a gentleman, proud of your crisp, starched collar, oblivious to the fact that it could literally strangle you. You might complain about tight jeans or uncomfortable high heels, but at least your clothes aren't actively trying to send you to the grave. One of the most infamous dangers lurked in the color palette, arsenic-laced dyes. The vibrant green, known as Scheele's green or Paris green, was incredibly popular for dresses, wallpapers, and artificial flowers. This pigment contained copper arsenite, a highly toxic compound. Imagine wearing a beautiful, flowing green gown to a ball. As you dance, the arsenic dust from the fabric subtly flakes off. You inhale it, it absorbs into your skin through sweat, and it contaminates your food and drink. Your beautiful dress is slowly poisoning you. Symptoms would include skin lesions, nausea, headaches, and over time, organ damage and even death. It's like buying a sweater today that comes with a warning label, may cause liver failure. And it wasn't just green. Other popular colors, like certain purples and blacks, also sometimes contained heavy metals such as lead or mercury, which were equally toxic. Factory workers who manufactured these dyes often suffered terribly from direct exposure, experiencing horrific skin conditions, respiratory problems, and chronic poisoning. The drive for vibrant, inexpensive colors directly led to widespread industrial and domestic misery. Beyond color, the very structure of Victorian fashion posed serious threats. The corset, a ubiquitous garment for women, was designed to cinch the waist to an extreme degree, creating the fashionable hourglass silhouette. Imagine being tightly laced into a corset for hours, day after day. This extreme compression displaced internal organs, constricted breathing, and led to a host of health problems, fainting spells due to restricted lung capacity, indigestion, muscle atrophy, and even fractured ribs. Imagine trying to run a marathon in a steel-boned corset. You simply couldn't. It's like voluntarily wearing a medieval torture device for fashion. The tight lacing phenomenon was particularly disturbing. While not every woman laced to the extreme, the ideal promoted a deeply unnatural shape. The misery was not just physical discomfort, it was the psychological pressure to conform to an ideal that literally squeezed the life out of you, often contributing to a frail, sickly appearance that was ironically seen as desirable, a common historical fact. The dandy collar for men, popular in the early to mid-Victorian era, was so tall and stiffly starched that it was sometimes referred to as a strangler or suicide collar. There are even apocryphal tales, though difficult to definitively prove, of men dying in their sleep after too much drink, their rigid collars literally cutting off circulation when their heads slumped forward. This highlights the dangers men faced in their own pursuit of rigid sartorial standards. Imagine your shirt collar being so stiff it's a choking hazard. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about fashion's deadly embrace involves mercury in felt hats. For gentlemen, beaver or rabbit fur felt hats were a staple. However, the process of kerating the fur, treating it with mercury nitrate to make the fibers felt easily exposed, hat makers to severe mercury poisoning. This led to neurological damage, tremors, speech impediments, and dementia, giving rise to the phrase mad as a hatter. Imagine crafting a stylish accessory, only to slowly lose your mind in the process. The misery wasn't just for the wearer, but for the unseen laborers who literally went insane for fashion. Then there were the flammable fabrics. Many fashionable Victorian dresses, particularly those made with light, airy materials like muslin or tulle, were highly flammable. The wide, voluminous skirts could easily brush against open flames from gaslights, candles, or fireplaces, leading to horrific, often fatal, accidents. Imagine a woman's dress catching fire in an instant, turning her into a living torch in a crowded ballroom. The specter of such a fiery death was a real and terrifying risk, especially in an era before widespread fire safety regulations. The sheer impracticality and weight of many garments also contributed to misery. Women's dresses could weigh many pounds, laden with layers of fabric, crinolines, hoop skirts, and bustles. Imagine dragging around what amounts to a small tent on your body all day. This made movement difficult, physically exhausting, and incredibly cumbersome. The misery was in the constant physical burden, the restriction of movement, and the sheer effort required just to exist gracefully in these elaborate ensembles. The psychological impact of such dangerous and restrictive fashion was profound. It meant that self-expression through clothing came with a terrifying price. Women in particular were trapped in a paradox. To be fashionable was to risk their health and comfort. Yet to defy fashion was to risk social ostracization. This fostered a deep sense of vulnerability and a quiet desperation to conform, even at personal peril. The misery wasn't just the physical discomfort, but the internal conflict of literally poisoning yourself or compressing your organs for the sake of societal acceptance. The academic debate about the motivations behind these extreme fashions often grapples with the interplay between societal pressure, economic status, and aesthetic ideals. Some historians argue that while the dangers were real, Victorian individuals often embraced these fashions as expressions of identity, social aspirations, and artistic ideals, suggesting that the discomfort was tolerated as a necessary part of participating in a highly visual culture, and that the allure of elegance often outweighed health concerns. They contend that people made conscious, if ill-informed, choices. The misery, in this view, was a byproduct of a greater cultural value. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense societal pressure, particularly on women, to conform to specific body ideals and sartorial norms, arguing that these fashions were less about individual choice and more about external control, contributing significantly to widespread physical suffering, disease, and accidental deaths, making them a truly oppressive and miserable aspect of Victorian life. They suggest that the allure of fashion masked a darker reality of exploitation and constraint. It's a debate that makes you ponder the often disturbing relationship between beauty, social status, and human suffering throughout history. As the suffocating embrace of Victorian corsets and the chilling shimmer of arsenic-laced gowns from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday fashion in the Victorian era was a truly dangerous and miserable experience. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were fundamental challenges that brought real discomfort, profound health risks, and often an early death to those who wore them. Their style, while however elegant, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of literal self-poisoning or physical disfigurement. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, breathable fabrics, the safety standards, and the freedom of modern clothing, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life, as the suffocating embrace of Victorian corsets and the chilling shimmer of arsenic-laced gowns from our last chapter mercifully unravel. Allowing the quiet hum of your room to truly settle around you, we now plunge into perhaps the most fundamental and pervasive source of misery in Victorian everyday life: sanitation's foul realities. Forget your indoor plumbing, waste treatment plants, and regular trash collection. In the Victorian era, particularly in burgeoning American cities, life was often lived amidst a pervasive, suffocating blanket of filth, turning urban landscapes into breeding grounds for disease and despair. Imagine yourself perhaps in the narrow, bustling streets of a rapidly growing city like Chicago or New York in the mid-19th century. The air is thick, not just with the smoke from countless factory chimneys and coal fires, but with a far more noxious smell. Your nostrils are assailed by the reek of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and stagnant water. You step carefully, trying to avoid the puddles of dubious origin and the piles of refuse that litter the cobblestones. You might complain about a traffic jam or a messy public park after a big event, but at least your city isn't actively trying to poison you through its air and water. The fundamental problem was the explosion of urban populations, combined with a profound lack of understanding about public health infrastructure. Cities grew at an unprecedented rate due to industrialization and immigration, but the systems to support such dense populations simply didn't exist or were woefully inadequate. People poured into tenements and crowded districts, exacerbating already strained resources. Human waste disposal was a monumental nightmare. While some wealthy homes had rudimentary flushing toilets that emptied into cesspits, for the vast majority, chamber pots were the norm. These would often be emptied directly into the streets, into communal overflowing privies, outhouses, or in some cases, into open sewers or rivers that also served as sources of drinking water. Imagine the sheer volume of human excrement accumulating daily in the narrow alleyways and crowded courtyards of a tenement block. The stench would be unbearable, particularly in warmer months. It's like living next to a perpetually overflowing porta-potty. But it's everywhere. This rampant human waste, combined with animal waste from horses, livestock brought to market, and stray animals, created a constant, putrid layer of filth. Horses, the primary mode of transportation, produced tons of manure daily, which also accumulated on the streets. Think of the flies, the rats, the cockroaches, all drawn to this endless buffet of decomposing organic matter. These creatures were not just a nuisance, they were critical vectors for disease, moving seamlessly between piles of waste and the food sources of unsuspecting citizens. Then there was the problem of garbage and refuse. Without organized municipal waste collection, household rubbish, factory waste, and dead animals were often simply dumped wherever convenient in vacant lots, along riverbanks, or directly into the streets. Imagine walking past mountains of rotting food, discarded industrial byproducts, and the decaying carcasses of dogs and cats. This wasn't just unsightly, it was a constant source of airborne disease, foul odors, and widespread misery. Your weekly trash pickup might seem mundane, but it's a modern miracle compared to this. Water contamination was perhaps the most deadly consequence of this abysmal sanitation. Rivers that flowed through cities were often simultaneously used for drinking water, industrial discharge, and as open sewers. Imagine dipping your bucket into a river that just upstream had raw sewage flowing into it, or a tannery dumping its chemicals. Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were rampant and recurrent, sweeping through cities and claiming thousands of lives. These were truly horrifying illnesses, causing severe dehydration, excruciating abdominal pain, and often a rapid, agonizing death. A common historical fact. The Great Stink of London in 1858, while specifically referring to London, perfectly illustrates the sanitation crisis that plagued many major Victorian cities, including American ones. The River Thames, used as a dumping ground for raw sewage. became so overwhelmed during a hot summer that its stench was unbearable throughout the city, bringing all government functions to a standstill and spurring significant reform efforts. Imagine your city's main river being so utterly putrid that politicians couldn't even work in their offices. That's the level of environmental misery we're talking about. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about Victorian sanitation involves night soil men. While the wealthy often had cesspits emptied by these laborers, for many, there was no formal system. Night soil men would collect human waste, often under the cover of darkness to avoid the worst of the stench and public outcry. However, these men operated under horrific conditions, often spreading disease themselves due to lack of hygiene and proper equipment. And where did the waste go? Often to farms as fertilizer, or simply dumped in less visible but still polluting areas. Imagine a job where your entire day revolves around shoveling raw human excrement, knowing you're likely getting sick from it. The sheer grittiness of this unseen labor highlights the profound misery embedded in simply managing the basic biological functions of a densely populated society. It makes you realize how many people lived in truly disgusting conditions, just so others could pretend they didn't. The cumulative effect of this pervasive filth and disease was a deeply depressing and anxiety-inducing daily existence for the vast majority of Victorians. The air you breathed, the water you drank, and the ground you walked on were all potential sources of deadly illness. There was no escape. The constant presence of foul odors, the sight of decaying waste, and the knowledge that disease could strike at any moment fostered a profound sense of fatalism and hopelessness. The misery wasn't just the physical discomfort, it was the psychological burden of living in an environment that seemed actively hostile to human health. This profound misery disproportionately affected the urban poor. While the wealthy could build their houses away from the worst of the slums, or afford cleaner water delivered to their homes, the working classes were trapped in overcrowded, unsanitary tenements. Their limited resources meant they often had no choice but to drink contaminated water, live amidst their own waste, and work in environments that compounded their exposure to disease. For them, life was a continuous battle against the filth, a fight they often lost. The academic debate about the speed and effectiveness of public health reforms in the Victorian era often grapples with the tension between scientific discovery and societal implementation. Some historians argue that despite the initial horrors, the Victorian era eventually saw significant advancements in public health, driven by pioneering figures like Edwin Chadwick and John Snow, whose work on germ theory and sanitation eventually led to widespread infrastructural improvements like modern sewage systems and clean water supplies, suggesting that the misery was a transitional phase leading to a healthier future. They contend that human ingenuity eventually triumphed. The misery in this view was temporary and ultimately overcome. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense suffering and loss of life that occurred before these reforms took hold, and the continued inequalities in sanitation even after improvements began, arguing that for generations of Victorians, daily life was indeed a prolonged nightmare of filth and disease, and that the benefits of reform were slow to reach the most vulnerable populations. They suggest that the sheer scale of the suffering often gets downplayed in a narrative of progress. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense human cost of scientific ignorance and slow societal change, and how utterly foundational clean water and sanitation are to human well-being. As the suffocating stench of Victorian waste and the chilling reality of ancient sanitation nightmares from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday life in the Victorian era was a truly foul and miserable experience. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real misery, profound illness, and widespread death to millions. Their very existence, when however brief, was always shadowed by the pervasive filth that surrounded them. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible infrastructure of modern sanitation, the clean water that flows from your tap, the efficient waste removal, and the understanding of public health, a reassurance that was a distant dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the pervasive stench of Victorian filth and the grim realities of ancient sanitation from our last chapter finally begin to recede, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now turn to a heartbreaking and deeply disturbing aspect of Victorian everyday life, childhood's grim labor. Forget your school buses, playgrounds, and child labor laws. In the Victorian era, for countless children, childhood was a brutal, short-lived period of relentless toil, exploitation, and profound suffering, turning what should have been a time of innocence into a harrowing battle for survival. Imagine yourself as a child, perhaps no older than 6 or 7, in a smoky industrial town like Pittsburgh or Lowell, Massachusetts, in the mid-1800s. Instead of waking up for school, you're jolted awake before dawn, your small body aching from the previous day's work. You might be heading to a textile mill, where the air is thick with cotton dust and the deafening roar of machinery. Or perhaps to a coal mine, where darkness and danger are your constant companions. You might complain about your homework, but at least your biggest worry isn't losing a limb or your life before lunch. The Industrial Revolution, while bringing immense wealth to some, created an insatiable demand for cheap labor, and children were the most vulnerable targets. Their small size made them ideal for certain tasks, like fitting into narrow mine shafts or reaching under machinery to clear jams. Their nimble fingers were considered perfect for intricate textile work. And, most chillingly, they could be paid a pittance, making them incredibly attractive to profit-driven factory owners. Textile mills were particularly notorious. Children as young as 5 or 6, often called doffers or piecers, worked long hours, typically 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Imagine standing for hours on end, constantly bending, tying broken threads, or sweeping lint from around dangerous, fast-moving machinery. The air was often hot, humid, and filled with cotton dust, leading to chronic lung diseases like byssinosis or brown lung. The noise was deafening, the risk of injury constant. A moment's inattention could mean losing a finger, a hand, or even being dragged into the gears. You might worry about carpal tunnel from typing, but these kids worried about losing their entire arm. Then there were the coal mines, perhaps the most dangerous workplaces of all. Children as young as 4 or 5, known as trappers, would sit in pitch darkness for hours on end, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed. Older children, hurriers, would crawl through narrow, unventilated tunnels, pulling heavy carts of coal behind them. Imagine spending your entire childhood in perpetual darkness, breathing dust and damp air, your body constantly cramped, knowing that at any moment, the roof could collapse, an explosion could erupt, or you could be crushed by a runaway cart. The average life expectancy for a child miner was tragically short. Beyond the factories and mines, children worked in myriad other dangerous jobs. They were chimney sweeps, forced to climb hot, narrow flues, often getting stuck or suffering burns and respiratory illnesses. They worked in match factories, exposed to white phosphorus, which caused phossy jaw a horrific, disfiguring decay of the jawbone. They were street vendors, newsboys, and scavengers, facing exposure to the elements, crime, and starvation. The misery was not just physical, it was the theft of their childhood, the crushing of their spirits, and the profound injustice of their exploitation. A common historical fact. In the United States, states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, heavily industrialized, saw widespread child labor throughout the Victorian era. While some early attempts at child labor laws were made often focusing on education rather than outright bans, enforcement was weak and loopholes were rampant. Factory owners often lied about children's ages, and impoverished parents, desperate for income, were forced to send their children to work. This highlights the systemic nature of child exploitation, driven by both industrial demand and economic desperation. Imagine a school where the curriculum is just survival, One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about childhood labor in the Victorian era involves the climbing boys of chimney sweeping. These were often small, orphaned, or destitute boys, sometimes as young as 4, forced to ascend narrow, soot-choked chimneys to clean them. They faced immediate risks of suffocation, burns, and falls. In the long term, they suffered from chronic respiratory diseases, stunted growth, and a particular type of cancer known as chimney sweeps carcinoma, scrotal cancer, caused by prolonged exposure to soot. Imagine being so small you can fit inside a dirty chimney. And that's your job, for years, until your body gives out. The image of a child literally disappearing into a dark, dangerous flue to clean a wealthy family's chimney is a stark symbol of Victorian-era depravity. The lack of education compounded their misery. For many child laborers, formal schooling was an impossibility. They were illiterate, denied the chance to improve their circumstances, and trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and labor that often extended into adulthood. Their futures were as grim as their present. The psychological toll on these children was immense. They lived in constant fear of injury, punishment, and starvation. They were deprived of play, of parental nurturing as parents were often working equally long hours, and of any semblance of a normal childhood. This led to stunted emotional development, chronic stress, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. The misery wasn't just the physical pain, it was the profound trauma of a stolen childhood. Leaving deep, invisible scars that lasted a lifetime, this exploitation was largely ignored or even justified by many in society. Some believe that hard work from a young age built character, or that it kept poor children off the streets. This societal indifference, fueled by economic greed, further cemented the grim realities of child labor. The innocence of childhood was simply sacrificed on the altar of industrial progress. The academic debate about the role of child labor in the Victorian economy often grapples with the concept of necessity versus exploitation. Some historians argue that for many impoverished families, child labor, however brutal, was a stark necessity for survival, providing crucial income that kept families from starving, suggesting that while deplorable, it was an economic reality driven by the harsh conditions of the time, rather than solely malicious intent. They contend that it was a difficult choice, not a joyful one. The misery, in this view, was an outcome of systemic poverty. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense profits reaped by industrialists from this cheap labor and the moral failings of a society that allowed such widespread abuse, arguing that child labor was a clear exploitation of the vulnerable, causing irreparable physical and psychological harm that far outweighed any economic benefits to the children or their families. They suggest that the necessity argument often minimizes the profound human suffering involved. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense ethical dilemmas inherent in rapid industrialization, and the chilling willingness of a society to sacrifice its youngest members for economic gain. As the echoes of tiny footsteps in dark mines and the whirring of machines that stole childhoods from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday childhood in the Victorian era was a truly grim and miserable experience. These weren't just playful adventures, they were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound exploitation, and often an early death to millions of innocent children. Their youth, however brief, was always shadowed by the relentless demands of labor. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of child labor laws, the freedom to learn and play, and the expectation of a safe childhood, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life, as the heart-wrenching images of Victorian child labor and the crushing weight of their stolen innocence from our last chapter mercifully recede. Allowing the gentle hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now confront a stark and ever-present reality that permeated every aspect of Victorian life: death's pervasive presence. Forget your modern medical advancements and the relatively long life expectancies we enjoy. In the Victorian era, death was an intimate, almost constant companion, a grim reaper whose shadow touched nearly every family, shaping daily rituals, anxieties, and the very fabric of society. Imagine yourself in a bustling American city, perhaps New York or Philadelphia, in the mid-1800s. You're walking down a street, and it's not uncommon to see black crepe on a door, signifying a recent death within that home. The local newspaper's obituary column is extensive, filled with the names of children, young adults, and the elderly alike. The ringing of church bells for funerals is a frequent sound. You might see a hearse pass by multiple times a day. You might feel sad when you hear of a distant relative passing, but back then, death was a neighbor, a household guest, a constant, tangible threat. The most disturbing fact was the sheer high mortality rate, particularly for infants and children. While we mourn the loss of a child today as a rare tragedy, in the Victorian era, it was an agonizingly common occurrence. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, and cholera. Remember those sanitation horrors from Chapter 3 swept through communities with devastating speed, often claiming multiple children from the same family. Imagine the profound emotional toll a mother giving birth to many children, knowing, with a heartbreaking certainty, that not all of them would live to adulthood. It was less about celebrating a new life and more about bracing for inevitable loss. The average life expectancy was drastically lower than today. While some individuals lived to old age, the high rates of infant and childhood mortality drastically skewed the averages. A man or woman reaching 50 or 60 was considered old, and even then, their bodies were often worn down by years of hard labor. Poor nutrition and chronic illness, a common historical fact. The infant mortality rate in Victorian Britain and the United States was staggeringly high, often exceeding 150 deaths per 1,000 live births in urban areas, and sometimes much higher in impoverished industrial centers. This means that more than 1 in 7 or even 1 in 5 children would not survive to their first birthday. Compare that to modern rates, which are often below 5 deaths per 1,000 births in developed nations. This stark reality profoundly impacted family sizes, emotional resilience, and societal attitudes towards life and loss. Imagine having to prepare for a child's funeral almost as often as a birth. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about Victorian death involves post-mortem photography. Because death, especially of children, was so common, and photography was a relatively new and expensive technology. Families often commissioned photographs of their deceased loved ones. These images, sometimes showing the deceased propped up as if alive with painted eyes or arranged poses, were often the only visual record a family would have of a child who died young. Imagine the chilling, poignant reality of your only photograph with your child being taken after they had passed away. This practice, while morbid to modern eyes, speaks volumes about the profound grief and the desperate desire to preserve a memory in an era of such frequent loss, highlighting the pervasive presence of death as a part of everyday life. It's a bittersweet, deeply unsettling memento. The constant presence of death fostered elaborate and often morbid rituals surrounding mourning and remembrance. Black clothing was worn for extended periods, sometimes years, by widows. Special jewelry made from the deceased's hair was common. Funerals were elaborate affairs, and the homes of the dead were transformed into spaces of solemn ritual, with mirrors covered and clocks stopped. Imagine the sheer weight of these rituals, constantly reminding the living of their losses and the inevitability of their own demise. Mourning wasn't just a private process, it was a highly public, regimented affair that dictated social behavior for months or even years. The misery wasn't just in the personal grief, but in the collective psychological burden. Society was, in a sense, permanently in mourning. This constant exposure to death, while perhaps making individuals more resilient in some ways, also infused everyday life with a pervasive sense of melancholy and fatalism. Life was understood to be fragile, fleeting, and constantly vulnerable to the unseen hand of disease or accident. For the working classes and the poor, death brought additional miseries. A death in the family often meant lost income, pushing already struggling families into deeper destitution. Burial costs could be crippling, forcing families to take out loans or resort to paupers' graves. The misery of grief was compounded by the crushing burden of economic hardship. Even the very act of dying could be miserable. Without effective pain relief or palliative care, death from many diseases was a prolonged, agonizing process. Families would often witness their loved ones suffering immensely. Unable to provide much comfort beyond a cool cloth and a prayer, imagine watching someone you love gasp for breath, racked with fever, and knowing there is absolutely nothing you can do but witness their slow, painful decline. The academic debate about the Victorian preoccupation with death often grapples with whether it was a healthy societal coping mechanism or a morbid obsession. Some historians argue that the elaborate mourning rituals and public displays of grief, while intense, provided essential social structures and psychological outlets for coping with such high mortality rates, suggesting that it was a functional response to a difficult reality, allowing communities to process and integrate loss into daily life. They contend that it fostered a sense of community support in times of sorrow. The misery, in this view, was acknowledged and communally shared. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense psychological toll of constant bereavement, the rigid social expectations of mourning that could be economically ruinous and emotionally suffocating, and the pervasive fear of disease and sudden death, arguing that the Victorian fascination with death was often a manifestation of profound anxiety, emotional repression, and a society struggling under an unbearable burden of loss. They suggest that the sheer scale of the suffering was profoundly debilitating. It's a debate that makes you ponder how humanity attempts to make sense of and live with the ultimate inevitability, and the chilling difference between grieving for a rarity and grieving for a constant companion. As the quiet tolling of Victorian funeral bells and the haunting images of their pervasive mortality from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday life in the Victorian era was a truly grim and death-haunted experience. These weren't just abstract concepts, they were fundamental challenges that brought real grief, profound fear, and constant reminders of human fragility to millions. Their lives, however long, were always shadowed by the very real possibility of an early demise. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern medicine, the relatively long life expectancies, and the understanding that childhood death is no longer a common occurrence, a reassurance that was a distant, heartbreaking dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the haunting echoes of Victorian death and the pervasive grief of lost loved ones from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now plunge into a more brutal and often public source of misery in Victorian everyday life. Crime and punishment's brutality. Forget your modern rehabilitation programs, Miranda rights, and discrete legal processes. In the Victorian era, justice was often swift, harsh, and designed as a terrifying public spectacle, inflicting immense suffering on both the accused and the condemned. Imagine yourself in a bustling American city, perhaps Boston or New Orleans, in the mid-1800s. You might be walking through a public square where a crowd has gathered around a gallows, or perhaps passing by a courthouse where a prisoner is being led away in shackles, his face a mask of despair. The threat of crime was real, but the terror of the punishment was arguably even more pervasive. You might worry about a speeding ticket, but back then, a minor infraction could lead to a public flogging or worse. The judicial system was, by our standards, incredibly harsh and often arbitrary. While the concept of innocent until proven guilty existed, legal representation was a luxury for the wealthy, and trials could be swift and brutal. Class bias was rampant. The poor and marginalized were far more likely to be accused, convicted, and subjected to the harshest penalties. Imagine being falsely accused of theft with no lawyer, facing a judge who already assumes your guilt based on your ragged clothes and lack of social standing. Your chances of a fair trial were slim to none. Public executions were a horrifyingly common spectacle throughout much of the Victorian era, particularly in the earlier decades. Hanging was the primary method, and these events drew vast crowds, eager for the morbid entertainment. Imagine standing in a packed square, gazing up at a gallows point, watching a man or woman take their last breaths at the end of a rope. The atmosphere was often a disturbing mix of solemnity, morbid curiosity, and even drunken revelry among the parts of the crowd. This wasn't just justice, it was a theatrical display of state power, designed to instill terror and deter crime through raw public spectacle. You might watch a true crime documentary, but they don't show you the actual agonizing death for entertainment. The misery wasn't just for the condemned. It was for their families, forced to witness such a public degradation and agonizing death. It was for the crowds, many of whom would be deeply disturbed by the gruesome sight, even if they claimed otherwise. The pervasive presence of these brutal events contributed to a societal acceptance of violence and a grim fatalism about the harshness of life, a common historical fact. In the United States, public hangings were a common form of capital punishment throughout much of the 19th century, drawing large crowds and sometimes even becoming social events. While some states began to move executions indoors or abolish them towards the end of the century. The image of the public gallows remained a potent symbol of Victorian justice. This practice highlights a stark difference in societal attitudes towards death and punishment compared to today, where executions, when they occur, are typically highly controlled and private affairs. Imagine taking your picnic basket to watch someone die. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about Victorian punishment involves penal treadmills and the crank. In prisons, especially in Britain, but influencing practices in the US, inmates were often subjected to pointless, excruciatingly hard labor on devices like the treadmill or the crank. The treadmill forced prisoners to climb an endless set of steps on a rotating cylinder, generating no power or useful output, purely as a form of grueling, exhausting punishment. The crank required prisoners to turn a handle repeatedly, sometimes thousands of times a day, often against increasing resistance, also for no productive purpose. Imagine being forced to run on an endlessly moving staircase for 8 hours a day, or turn a handle until your arms scream, purely to suffer. This was a form of psychological torture combined with physical exhaustion, designed to break the spirit of the prisoner, and it epitomizes the era's focus on punitive, rather than rehabilitative, justice. It's like a gym workout, but your only goal is utter misery. Beyond capital punishment, the physical brutality of other penalties was significant. Flogging whipping was still used for various offenses, particularly in military and naval settings, but also sometimes for civil crimes. Imagine being publicly whipped, your back lacerated, as a crowd watched. Hard labor in prisons, often for minor offenses, was designed to be agonizing and dehumanizing, breaking the spirit as much as the body. Prisoners were often malnourished, subjected to solitary confinement, and held in unsanitary conditions, remember Chapter 3, making the prison experience a living hell. The conditions in debtors' prisons were also notoriously grim. Though debtors' prisons were largely abolished in the US, by the mid-19th century, earlier than in Britain, the fear of being imprisoned for unpaid debts loomed large in the early Victorian period. Imagine being locked away indefinitely, not for a crime, but for the inability to pay a debt, leaving your family to starve outside. The misery here was economic ruin compounded by imprisonment, a cruel twist of fate for those already struggling. The psychological impact of such a brutal justice system was profound. It fostered a pervasive sense of fear and insecurity, not just among criminals, but among the general populace. Knowing that even minor transgressions could lead to severe public punishment created an atmosphere of anxiety and suppression. For those who were accused or had family members caught in the system, the misery was immense, the shame, the helplessness, and the agony of witnessing or enduring such cruelty. This was a society where the threat of pain was constantly visible. This harsh system also reinforced social inequalities. The poor, with limited legal recourse and often desperate circumstances, were disproportionately targeted and punished. Their lives were considered less valuable, their suffering less significant, by a system designed to protect property and maintain social order at any cost. The academic debate about the effectiveness of Victorian punishment methods often grapples with their stated goals versus their actual impact on crime rates and social behavior. Some historians argue that the harshness of Victorian justice, particularly public executions, was seen as a necessary deterrent in a rapidly industrializing society facing new forms of crime and social unrest, suggesting that while brutal, these methods were a pragmatic response to maintain order in a pre-modern policing era. They contend that it brought a crude form of stability. The misery, in this view, was a regrettable but functional aspect of social control. Conversely, other scholars emphasize that the brutality of the system often hardened criminals, contributed to recidivism, and created widespread social misery and resentment without effectively curbing crime, arguing that it reflected a society's deep-seated anxieties about poverty and social change, rather than a truly effective approach to justice. They suggest that the spectacle of punishment often backfired, creating more misery than it prevented. It's a debate that makes you ponder the often disturbing relationship between justice, power, and human cruelty throughout history, and how the fear of punishment shapes a society. As the chilling echoes of Victorian gallows and the brutal whir of penal treadmills from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why everyday life in the Victorian era was a truly harsh and terrifying experience when it came to crime and punishment. These weren't just abstract legal concepts. They were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound fear, and often an agonizing public death to millions. Their freedom, however limited, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of a brutal justice. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern legal protections. The focus on rehabilitation and the general absence of public torture, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the chilling echoes of Victorian gallows and the brutal whir of penal treadmills from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now descend into perhaps the most widespread and inescapable source of misery for millions in Victorian everyday life: urban slums and poverty. Forget your subsidized housing, social safety nets, and basic sanitation. In the Victorian era, for vast swathes of the population, life was a continuous, brutal struggle against starvation, disease, and dehumanizing squalor, turning vibrant cities into festering pits of despair. Imagine yourself, not as a wealthy industrialist, but as a recent immigrant or a displaced rural worker, arriving in a booming American city like New York's Five Points or Boston's North End in the mid-19th century. You're seeking work, a better life. But what you find is a crushing reality. You're crammed into an overcrowded tenement building where dozens of families share a single water pump and a handful of overflowing privies. The air is foul, the darkness pervasive, and the constant gnawing of hunger is your daily companion. You might complain about your rent, but at least your apartment isn't a single room shared by a dozen people, with rats as your constant roommates. The rapid urbanization driven by the Industrial Revolution created unprecedented overcrowding. People flocked to cities for work, but housing infrastructure simply couldn't keep pace. This led to the proliferation of vast slums, dense, unregulated neighborhoods where poverty was the defining characteristic. Tenements, often repurposed existing buildings or hastily constructed, packed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people into spaces originally designed for far fewer. Overcrowding was extreme. Imagine entire families, often numbering 6 or more, living and sleeping in a single small room, perhaps sharing a bed, or simply sleeping on the floor. Privacy was a non-existent luxury. This created immense social tension, as well as a perfect environment for the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Remember those from Chapter 3. It was like living in a perpetual sardine can, but the sardines were sick and desperate. Sanitation in the slums was virtually non-existent, exacerbating all the horrors we discussed in Chapter 3. Open sewers, overflowing cesspits, and piles of uncollected garbage were the norm. Clean water was scarce and often contaminated, leading to constant outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Imagine the smell, the flies, the rats, the constant battle against grime in an environment where simply getting clean water was a Herculean task. For the slum dwellers, life was a losing fight against the elements and their own waste. Malnutrition and starvation were rampant. While some might find work, wages were often so low and employment so precarious that a single illness or accident could plunge a family into desperate hunger. Food, when available, was often adulterated or of poor quality. We'll get to that in Chapter 8. Imagine the constant gnawing pain of hunger, the weakness in your limbs, the sight of your children with distended bellies, all while struggling to find enough pennies to buy even a stale piece of bread. The misery here was primal, fundamental, and relentless, a common historical fact in New York City's Five Points neighborhood, a notorious slum district throughout much of the 19th century. Living conditions were among the worst in the world. Tenements were packed, sanitation was abysmal, and crime and disease were rampant. This neighborhood became a symbol of urban squalor and the profound misery of immigrant and impoverished communities. Drawing attention from reformers but remaining a persistent blight for decades. Imagine an entire neighborhood where simply staying alive was a daily, exhausting struggle. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about urban slums involves the rent-by-the-bed system. In some of the most desperate tenement areas, landlords would rent out beds, or even just space on the floor, on a nightly basis to single men or very poor individuals. Imagine sharing a room with a dozen strangers, each paying a few pennies for a temporary sleeping spot, with no security, no privacy, and little hope for a permanent home. This system exemplified the extreme commodification of basic human needs and the utter lack of dignity afforded to the most vulnerable, highlighting the depth of desperation that widespread poverty created. It's like a terrible permanent slumber party, but everyone is miserable and desperate. The lack of heating and proper clothing in harsh winters added another layer of misery. Without adequate fuel or warm garments, tenement dwellers, particularly children and the elderly, often suffered from exposure, frostbite, and respiratory illnesses. Imagine huddled together in a freezing room, trying to generate enough body heat to survive the night, listening to the coughs of your sick family members. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a deadly threat. The psychological toll on those living in urban slums was immense. The constant struggle for survival, the indignity of their living conditions, the pervasive disease, and the hopelessness of their situation fostered deep despair, chronic stress, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness. For many, alcoholism was a common coping mechanism, leading to further ruin. The misery wasn't just physical pain, it was the profound erosion of dignity, self-respect, and hope, leaving millions in a state of perpetual psychological torment. This widespread poverty and misery was largely ignored by the wealthy elite, or viewed with a disturbing mix of pity and moral judgment. Many believed poverty was a result of individual failings rather than systemic issues, further cementing the despair of those trapped in the slums. The glittering balls and grand mansions of the wealthy stood in stark contrast to the festering misery just a few blocks away. A stark testament to the profound social stratification of the era, the academic debate about the causes and solutions to Victorian urban poverty often grapples with the interplay of individual responsibility versus systemic forces. Some historians argue that while industrialization created immense challenges, individual choices, lack of foresight, or moral failings such as excessive drinking contributed significantly to perpetuating poverty for many, suggesting that a degree of agency, however limited, still existed within these grim conditions. and that self-help movements were sometimes effective. They contend that not all misery was externally imposed. The misery in this view was complex and multifaceted. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the overwhelming systemic forces: low wages, unstable employment, lack of social services, and rampant discrimination, arguing that for the vast majority of slum dwellers, poverty was an inescapable trap, a direct consequence of a brutally unregulated capitalist system that exploited the vulnerable, making their daily lives a relentless and dehumanizing struggle with little hope of escape. They suggest that the concept of choice was a cruel illusion for millions. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense scale of human suffering unleashed by unchecked industrialization, and the enduring question of who truly bears responsibility for the plight of the poor, as the oppressive shadows of Victorian slums and the pervasive stench of urban squalor from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why everyday life for the poor in the Victorian era was a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just abstract economic conditions. They were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound hunger, and constant dehumanization to millions. Their existence, however hard won, was always shadowed by the crushing weight of poverty. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, if imperfect, social safety nets of modern society, the basic standards of housing, and the expectation of clean water and sanitation, a reassurance that was a distant, heartbreaking dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the oppressive shadows of Victorian slums and the pervasive stench of urban squalor from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now unveil a truly insidious and often invisible source of misery that plagued every Victorian household. From the grandest mansion to the humblest tenement, food adulteration's deceit. Forget your food safety regulations, clear ingredient labels, and trusted quality controls. In the Victorian era, the very food and drink you consumed daily were routinely, and often lethally, poisoned with dangerous chemicals, sawdust, and other horrifying substitutes, turning every meal into a perilous gamble. Imagine yourself sitting down to a seemingly wholesome meal in, say, a quiet home in rural Vermont, or a bustling boarding house in Baltimore in the late 1800s. You're enjoying your bread, perhaps a cup of coffee or tea, and a slice of cheese. But what you don't realize is that your bread might contain plaster. Your coffee might be mixed with ground chicory and dirt, and your tea could be dyed with Prussian blue. You might worry about genetically modified organisms or a little too much sugar, but at least your food isn't actively laced with lead or copper. The driving force behind this widespread fraud was sheer economic greed. With burgeoning populations and increasing demand, unscrupulous manufacturers and vendors found countless ways to maximize profits by reducing costs. This often meant diluting genuine products, adding cheaper and often dangerous fillers, or using toxic chemicals to enhance appearance or preserve perishable goods. There were virtually no food safety laws or regulatory bodies to protect the consumer, leaving everyone at the mercy of deceptive practices. Bread, the staple of the Victorian diet, was a prime target. Bakers often added alum, aluminum, potassium sulfate to make inferior flour appear whiter and improve the texture, which could cause digestive problems. Even worse, some used plaster of Paris, chalk, or pipe clay as fillers to increase weight and volume. Literally selling people dirt and plaster instead of nutritious bread? Imagine trying to feed your family, believing you're giving them nourishment, when in reality, they're slowly ingesting building materials. It's like finding concrete dust in your breakfast cereal. Milk was another major culprit. To extend its volume, milk was often watered down. To make this diluted milk appear richer, dangerous additives like chalk or plaster were used to restore its white color, or even worse, brain matter from slaughtered animals was sometimes added. And to prevent spoilage, even more toxic chemicals like formaldehyde were occasionally used. Imagine giving your child a glass of milk, completely unaware it's a watery solution mixed with chalk and an embalming fluid. The misery here wasn't just the deceit, it was the direct link to widespread illness, especially among children who consumed large quantities of contaminated milk. Tea and coffee were not safe either. Tea leaves were often reconditioned after being brewed, dyed with Prussian blue or copper carbonate to restore their color, and then mixed with anything from sawdust, sand, or dried leaves from other plants. Coffee, a luxury for some, was frequently adulterated with chicory. Roasted beans, not coffee beans, dried carrots, or even just dirt and gravel. Imagine paying for a comforting cup of coffee, only to realize you're essentially drinking mud and pebbles, a common historical fact. The widespread adulteration of food was so rampant that it sparked significant public concern, and eventually led to the passage of some of the earliest food safety legislation in both Britain and the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, though enforcement remained a challenge. Pioneering journalists and scientists known as muckrakers in the U.S. played a crucial role in exposing these shocking practices, highlighting the dire need for reform. This period marked a critical turning point in recognizing that the market alone would not protect public health. Imagine needing investigative journalists just to figure out if your dinner was going to kill you. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about food adulteration involves confectionery and sweets. Victorian candies were often colored with incredibly toxic heavy metals to achieve vibrant hues. For example, bright green sweets might contain copper arsenite, the same deadly chemical from Chapter 2's dresses. Red sweets could be colored with red lead chromate, and yellow with lead chromate. Imagine a child happily eating a brightly colored lollipop, blissfully unaware that they are literally consuming lead and arsenic, suffering from lead poisoning or chronic arsenic exposure that caused stomach pains, convulsions, or even death. This turn of poisonous beauty into deadly treats highlights the casual disregard for public health, especially when it came to appealing to children. It's like being thrilled by a colorful candy, only to realize it's a tiny, delicious poison pill. Even spices were not immune. Ground pepper was often mixed with dust, ground olive pits, or even sand. Mustard was extended with flour and dyed with turmeric or lead chromate to give it a brighter yellow color. This wasn't just about cheating the customer. It was about introducing unknown, potentially harmful substances into everyday meals. The consequences of food adulteration were dire and widespread. It contributed significantly to the high rates of chronic illness. Digestive problems, malnutrition as people weren't getting the nutrients they thought they were, and even direct poisoning. The misery was not just the physical pain of illness, but the profound sense of betrayal. You couldn't trust your baker, your grocer, or even the food itself. This created a pervasive anxiety around every meal, a silent fear of the hidden poisons lurking in everyday provisions. For the poor, the situation was even worse. They could least afford to be defrauded and were most dependent on cheap, mass-produced goods, which were often the most heavily adulterated. Their already precarious health, battered by poor sanitation and long working hours, remember? Chapter 4, was further undermined by the very food they ate. The psychological impact of such widespread deception was immense. It eroded trust in institutions and individuals, fostering a cynical outlook on commercial dealings. The constant uncertainty about the safety and purity of basic necessities added a layer of stress to an already difficult existence. The misery wasn't just physical, it was the profound sense of vulnerability. The realization that even the act of sustenance was a daily risk. The academic debate about the precise health impact of food adulteration often grapples with the difficulty of distinguishing its effects from other concurrent health crises, like poor sanitation and infectious diseases. Some historians argue that while individual instances of poisoning were severe, the overall impact of adulteration might have been secondary compared to rampant infectious diseases or widespread malnutrition caused by poverty itself, suggesting that while it was certainly a form of fraud, it wasn't always the primary driver of mass mortality. They contend that human resilience could sometimes overcome minor doses of toxins. The misery, in this view, was less about immediate death and more about chronic ill health and economic exploitation. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the cumulative effect of daily ingestion of various toxins, the specific vulnerability of children to even small amounts of heavy metals, and the overall undermining of nutritional intake, arguing that food adulteration contributed significantly and directly to widespread illness, premature death, and general debilitation across all social classes, making it a critical and horrifying aspect of Victorian misery. They suggest that the invisible poison in food was a silent killer that should not be underestimated. It's a debate that makes you ponder how much we rely on the unseen integrity of our food supply, and the terrifying realities of a world where basic trust in what you eat was utterly broken. As the deceptive flavors of Victorian adulterated food and the chilling echoes of everyday poisons from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why every meal in the Victorian era was a truly perilous and miserable experience. These weren't just poor culinary choices. They were fundamental challenges that brought real illness, profound distrust, and often a slow, agonizing death to millions. Their nourishment, however essential, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of hidden poisons. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern food safety laws, the clear ingredient labels, and the general expectation that your food will not actively harm you, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life, as the deceptive flavors of Victorian adulterated food and the chilling echoes of everyday poisons from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calming presence. We now delve into one of the most chilling and often hidden sources of misery in Victorian everyday life: mental health's dark asylum. Forget your modern therapy, compassionate care, and nuanced understanding of the mind. In the Victorian era, mental illness was largely misunderstood, feared, and met with brutal treatments, dehumanizing institutions, and a profound social stigma that turned personal suffering into a living nightmare. Imagine yourself, perhaps as someone in a respectable family in a quaint American town like Concord, Massachusetts, or Charleston, South Carolina in the late 1800s. You or a loved one begins to exhibit behaviors that are deemed unusual, melancholic, or agitated. Instead of seeking understanding or support, the response is often fear, shame, and the chilling prospect of being confined to an asylum, a place where sanity was rarely restored, and human dignity was often stripped away. You might feel a little awkward discussing mental health today, but at least you don't face the prospect of being locked away for exhibiting signs of sadness. The fundamental problem was the profound lack of scientific understanding about the human brain and mental illness. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder were often lumped together under broad, vague terms like lunacy, melancholia, or madness. The causes were attributed to everything from moral failing, hereditary weakness, a sudden shock, or even female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for women who exhibited any challenging emotions or behaviors. This ignorance led to a deep-seated fear and a punitive, rather than therapeutic, approach to treatment. The rise of the asylum system was initially seen as a progressive move away from chaining the insane in workhouses or jails. However, these institutions quickly became overcrowded, underfunded, and often horrifying places of confinement rather than healing. Imagine being committed to an asylum, your personal identity slowly stripped away, your clothes are replaced with institutional garb, your name reduced to a number, and your days spent in monotonous, often degrading routines. The treatments inflicted upon patients were nothing short of barbaric. These often included restraints. Patients were frequently tied down, sometimes for days or weeks, with straitjackets, leather straps, or chains. Imagine being mentally distressed, and instead of comfort, you are physically immobilized, your limbs aching, your mind further tormented by confinement. Hydrotherapy. This involved dousing patients with freezing cold water or forcing them into prolonged hot baths, sometimes for hours. The shock was believed to cure, but often caused hypothermia, burns, or extreme distress, purging, and bloodletting. Echoing our discussions from Chapter 1, these methods were still employed, believed to rid the body of toxins causing mental imbalance. Spinning chairs and tranquilizing chairs. Patients might be spun rapidly in a chair, or strapped into chairs designed to keep them motionless for hours, sometimes with cold water dripping on their heads, all meant to calm or reorient them. Imagine a violent carnival ride designed to cure your anxiety, a common historical fact. The moral treatment movement, prominent in the early Victorian era, influenced by figures like Dorothea Dix in the U.S., attempted to provide a more humane approach to asylum care, emphasizing kindness, routine, and a tranquil environment. However, as asylums became overwhelmed by patient numbers and underfunded, the ideals of moral treatment often gave way to custodial care, neglect, and increasingly harsh methods of control, marking a tragic decline in the quality of care for many institutions. This highlights the gap between noble intentions and grim realities. Imagine a beautiful, serene building meant for healing, slowly transforming into a crowded, frightening prison. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about Victorian mental health involves the fear of pauper lunatics and the use of workhouses as de facto asylums. For the poor, if deemed mentally unwell, they often had no recourse but the dreaded workhouse. These were not specialized institutions, but grim, overcrowded places designed for the destitute, where the mentally ill were often chained, neglected, and mixed with criminals and the able-bodied poor. Imagine being confused and vulnerable, and instead of being helped, you're thrown into a chaotic, punitive environment where your basic human needs are barely met, and your mental state only deteriorates further. This demonstrates the profound class divide in mental health care, where the poor suffered the most brutal and undignified forms of confinement. It's like being punished for your illness. The social stigma attached to mental illness was immense. A family with a mad member would often hide them away, or commit them to an asylum to avoid public shame. The perceived taint of madness could ruin a family's reputation, affecting marriage prospects and social standing. Imagine the profound isolation and despair felt by someone struggling with mental health, knowing that their very condition made them an outcast, a source of shame, rather than someone deserving of compassion and help. The misery wasn't just the internal torment, it was the cruel judgment and rejection from society. For women, the situation was particularly dire. Any behavior deemed unfeminine or overly emotional could lead to a diagnosis of hysteria and subsequent confinement. Women who were defiant, intelligent, or simply strong-willed could find themselves institutionalized, their voices silenced, their lives controlled by male authorities. Imagine being a woman in the 19th century, feeling frustrated or angry about societal constraints, only to be told you're mad and need to be locked away for your own good. The psychological impact of such a system was profound. For those suffering from mental illness, the asylum often became a place that exacerbated their condition rather than alleviating it, stripping them of autonomy, dignity, and hope. The constant threat of confinement, the fear of losing control of one's mind, and the deep-seated societal prejudice contributed to immense anxiety and internal suffering. The misery wasn't just the original illness, but the additional trauma inflicted by a system meant to help. The academic debate about the legacy of Victorian asylums often grapples with their complex role in medical history. Some historians argue that, despite their flaws, Victorian asylums represented a significant, albeit imperfect, step towards segregating and professionalizing the care of the mentally ill, moving them out of jails and poorhouses, and laying some groundwork for future psychiatric understanding, even if treatments were primitive. They contend that it was a slow, painful evolution, The misery in this view was part of a larger necessary process of societal learning. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the pervasive neglect, abuse, and dehumanization that occurred within these institutions, arguing that the asylum system, for most patients, functioned more as a form of social control and warehousing for the inconvenient, rather than a genuine therapeutic environment, inflicting profound and lasting misery on countless individuals who were merely suffering from conditions we now understand and treat with compassion. They suggest that the progress narrative often overshadows the immense individual suffering. It's a debate that makes you ponder the terrifying power of societal misunderstanding and fear when confronted with the complexities of the human mind, and how much human dignity can be eroded in the name of care, as the chilling shadows of Victorian asylums and the haunting echoes of their brutal treatments from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why mental illness in the Victorian era was a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just personal struggles, they were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound dehumanization, and often lifelong confinement to millions. Their minds, however tormented, were always shadowed by the very real possibility of being locked away and forgotten. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, if imperfect, advancements in modern mental health care. The focus on compassion and understanding, and the growing destigmatization of mental illness, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of Victorian life. As the chilling shadows of Victorian asylums and the haunting echoes of their brutal treatments from our last chapter finally dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to fully embrace you. Our journey through the truly disturbing realities of Victorian everyday life now reaches its peaceful conclusion. This final chapter isn't about uncovering yet another historical horror. Instead, it's about the modern echoes and lessons learned how these Victorian struggles, though centuries removed from our meticulously regulated and technologically advanced societies, continue to resonate, often subtly, within our contemporary lives, offering profound insights into the enduring human experience. Imagine, if you will, looking around your own room right now. You're likely surrounded by an array of comforts and conveniences, advanced medical care at your fingertips. Clothes made from safe materials, clean water from the tap, readily available food that won't poison you, and a general expectation of safety and dignity. Yet, despite all our advancements, a deep, ancient part of our human experience still grapples with anxieties that are strikingly similar to those that made Victorian life so dreadful. You might scroll through social media on your phone, perhaps seeing a news report about a factory mishap or a health scare, or perhaps you feel a nagging concern about the well-being of someone you know struggling with their mental health. That, my friend, is the echo. One of the most immediate echoes is our continued, often unconscious, struggle with public health and systemic inequalities. While we no longer face cholera epidemics from open sewers, at least not in most developed nations, the fear of invisible pathogens is far from gone. Think about the anxieties surrounding global pandemics, the constant advice to wash your hands, or the subtle discomfort when someone coughs nearby. This modern vigilance, born from our scientific understanding of germs, is a direct descendant of the ancient dread of contagion that permeated Victorian cities. And while we have advanced medical science, disparities in healthcare access still exist, mirroring, in a much milder form, the horrors faced by the Victorian poor in workhouse infirmaries. The misery isn't the same, but the underlying vulnerability, particularly for marginalized groups, still resonates. Then there's the persistent challenge of consumer protection and corporate responsibility. While we have government agencies like the FDA and the modern ES that regulate food and drug safety, the temptation for unscrupulous businesses to cut corners for profit still exists. Think about recalls of contaminated food, scandals involving mislabeled products, or debates about the long-term effects of unregulated chemicals in consumer goods. This modern vigilance is a direct inheritance from the Victorian struggle against rampant food adulteration and the dangers lurking in everyday products like arsenic-laced wallpaper or mercury-laden hats. We've simply codified the lessons learned from an era where your bread could contain plaster and your candy could be poisoned. The echoes of labor exploitation, particularly for the most vulnerable, are also clear. While child labor on the scale seen in Victorian mills and mines is thankfully illegal in most countries, precarious work, sweatshops in developing nations, and the exploitation of migrant workers still exist. We might not see 5-year-olds working 14-hour days in our own towns, but the ethical debates surrounding global supply chains and fair labor practices are direct descendants of the Victorian battles against child labor and industrial abuses. The misery has been outsourced, perhaps, but the underlying injustice of economic exploitation persists. Even the ancient concept of social stigma and the treatment of mental illness subtly reverberates. While the days of brutal asylum treatments are largely behind us, the battle against mental health stigma continues. People still fear judgment, struggle to access adequate care, or feel isolated by their conditions. The ongoing efforts to destigmatize mental illness, to promote understanding, and to advocate for compassionate, evidence-based care are direct responses to the horrifying legacy of Victorian asylums and the widespread societal ignorance of the past. We still have a long way to go, but the path was forged by the recognition of immense suffering from generations past. And consider the broader theme of human resilience amidst adversity. Despite the overwhelming misery, we've explored the medical horrors, the deadly fashion, the pervasive filth, the brutal labor, the constant presence of death, the harsh justice, the crushing poverty, the poisoned food, and the terrifying treatment of mental illness. Victorians found ways to persist, to love, to create, and to innovate. Their era gave us incredible inventions, groundbreaking literature, and the very foundations of modern public health and social reform, often driven by a desperate need to alleviate the very miseries we've discussed. This reminds us of humanity's enduring capacity to adapt, to push for progress, and to find light even in the darkest of times. So, as our deep dive into the truly awful side of Victorian everyday life concludes, you are left with a profound understanding. These weren't just quaint historical footnotes. They were fundamental aspects of daily existence, shaping the joys and fears of millions in profound ways. They were born from genuine human misery, the pain of sickness, the terror of confinement, the burden of exhaustion, and the sting of exploitation. These everyday realities, despite the era's outward grandeur, offered a chilling mirror to the harsh realities of human existence, without the safety nets and scientific understanding we now possess. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, surrounded by the quiet hum of your modern world, recognize the faint echoes of these Victorian struggles. They whisper in our anxieties about health, in our demands for product safety, in our fight for fair labor, and in our ongoing efforts to create more compassionate and equitable societies. But tonight, there are no open sewers just outside your window. No factories demanding child labor, no immediate threat of arsenic in your food, and no fear of being locked away for your thoughts. The harsh realities of the past are now illuminated by scientific understanding and confined to the fascinating, yet sometimes grim, realm of history. So, let the echoes of these historical miseries fade now. Let the discomfort of past pain and the anxieties of forgotten perils dissolve into the quiet hum of your night. As you drift deeper into slumber, imagine the cool, clean air flowing freely, the nourishing food readily available, the soft security of your home. Feel the rhythmic rise and fall of your breath, a calming tide pulling you gently into the depths of rest. All tension, all worry, all the echoes of past suffering are now distant, quieted by the peace of your present moment. Your body grows heavy, your mind serene. Just rest now, and let the quietness of your peaceful space guide you into a deep, restorative sleep.